Norman Foster is the founder and executive chairman of Foster & Partners, a global studio for architecture, urbanism, and design. Rooted in sustainability, major projects include the Beijing Airport, 30 St. Mary Axe, also known as the Gherkin, the Great Court at the British Museum in London, the Hearst Headquarters Tower in New York, and the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Recent projects include Apple Park in California, Bloomberg's European headquarters in London, the Comcast Tower in Philadelphia, and the Norton Museum of Art on the other coast of Florida. Some of his current projects within the practice include 425 Park Avenue in New York and the Community Boathouse in Harlem. He is president of the Norman Foster Foundation based in Madrid with a global reach promoting interdisciplinary thinking and research to help new generations of architects, designers, and urbanists anticipate the future. He became the 21st Pritzker Architecture Prize laureate in 1999, and in 1997 he was appointed to the Order of Merit, and in 1999 was granted a life peerage in the Queen's Birthday Honors List, taking the title of Lord Foster of Thames Bank. So please, let's welcome Lord Norman Foster to the stage.
Thank you. Good evening. I'd like to share some reflections and experience of cities and architecture. So, why cities? Because cities are the future. More people are living in cities, will be living in cities. You could say that the city is our greatest invention. Cities generate 90% of global wealth. I mean, it's just worth considering that the GDP of New York is the same as that of Canada. The GDP of Los Angeles is the same as Australia. Not surprisingly, there's always a downside. They generate 70% of carbon dioxide emissions, greenhouse gases. So you could argue, as many have done already, that the key to combating climate change is more responsibly the domain of mayors and civic leaders. Cities will be absorbing 90% of global population expansion. Just to put that into context, that's something like 2 billion by 2050. And urbanization, the amount of building to accommodate that, which will take place mostly in Asia, Africa, to a lesser extent in Latin America. To put that into context, it's the equivalent of creating 18 Miami metro areas every year between now and then. So what kind of cities should we be encouraging in terms of that extraordinary explosion of urbanization, which will touch every city in some way, because cities are continually evolving and changing? But what kind of model should we be encouraging? Of course, there are many different kinds of cities, but simplistically, they divide into two kinds. There's the compact, high-density, pedestrian-friendly, walkable, neighborhood-style city. It can be ultra-high density, like Manhattan, or it can be high-density, medium-rise, like a European-style city, Boston in America, Copenhagen, Paris, a fairly familiar model. Arguably, we should not be encouraging the sprawling, car-borne model of a city. I know I'm in rather sensitive place here, but why? Well, in terms of energy, the compact city is about half that of the low-density car-borne city. And mobility might be one thing here in this Western-centric world that we all share and inhabit, but where that population growth is going, the car as we know it is not necessarily the democratic, spread out vision of mobility. Perhaps there's another reason to encourage the compact city, and that is that the many surveys which are conducted, arguably mostly Western-centric, but they all come out, the top 10 regularly here on 3 continents, Europe, North America, and Australia. They're all of the compact kind. What is a city? Again, simplistically, it has 2 components. It has the infrastructure of the connections, the public spaces, the parks, the bridges, the metro systems, the boulevards, the plazas. That determines what makes one city different from another. Arguably, it describes whether a city is beautiful or whether it's ugly, whether it's friendly. It determines its identity and its carbon footprint. You could say it's the urban glue which binds together the many individual buildings. So, for the purpose of this evening, I'm talking as an urbanist concerned with infrastructure, and I'm talking about as an architect concerned with the architecture of the individual buildings. So, cities, infrastructure, and buildings, I'll be looking at those kind of buildings which are the gateways to a nation, to a city, the connections, the bridges, the public spaces. A few examples. And along with the buildings, those which relate to culture, the workplace, to medical, to housing, and in that combination of looking at an individual building as an urbanist and looking at the architecture, the 2 interact. So there's an agenda which at times emphasis is on sustainability. It might be the social agenda. It might be the urbanistic dimension. And it's interesting that historically, the terminals, the portals of a city have always been celebratory. They tell you a lot about the values of that nation. So whether it's the 19th century and the birth of the railway mobility, the gateway in Paris to the rest of Europe, to far away as Russia, extraordinary, celebratory, symbolic entrance. If that's the 19th century, we go to the 15th century in Beijing, the Forbidden City, the portal to the city, the walled city. And it is the same sense of celebration, of symbolism, and that going back 20 years to what at that time was the biggest airport in the world that was created in 4 years for the 2008 Beijing Olympics. That is, in its own way, celebratory of China. In all kinds of interesting symbolic ways, the color of the roof is the same conscious color as the roof of the Forbidden City, the symbolism of the dragon. So that permeates the entrance arrival. So it's that sense of civic values, of civic pride, the same as the 19th century or going back centuries before that. Tracing the roots of the airports, and we've been involved in something like 10 airports so far, where did the reinvention in our terms of the airport start? It started in the 1980s 1981 to 91, because 91 was the launch of London's third airport. And if I go back to that period, the typical airport, you would walk into it, you would see all the pipework, the ducts, the fluorescent lighting. It would be essentially a black box which was the equivalent, if you like, in automotive terms of a gas guzzler. Because if you looked at a diagram of that, you took a cross-section, you can see the interior below that structure. What you're not seeing above the ducts, which are cutting out all the natural light, is the heavy machinery. So you've got the artificial lighting generating heat, you've got the cooling extracting that heat. So it's not very good in terms of sustainability, and it's not very joyful either. So really turning that literally upside down and then allowing the roof to bring in a view of the outside, natural light, putting all that heavyweight servicing below the terminal level, so it's easy to access in one stroke. And it looks very, very easy. It didn't come so easily, like anything which looks very, very simple. It seems to take an eternity to actually get there. But it's, in a way, everybody's dream. It saves energy. Natural light is free. The customer, the traveler, it's a better experience. And for those who are maintaining it, it's a dream compared with. So that kind of heavily serviced, no views of the outside was transformed into this. And that, if I now fast forward to an airport which is nearing completion in Kuwait, and you can see it is here in a different formal language, because availability of materials, the technology of the place favored creating something that would have a high thermal mass. This would be the first LEED Gold airport. And if this is the most recent airport nearing completion, then we've just won a competition for what will be the largest airport in the world, capability of 185 million passengers a year. And here, the terminal is dissolved into what is really a low-rise, high-density walled city, because it accepts the reality that the airport is a generator of many other kinds of buildings. So it's residential, it has its own ecosystem. You can see the green spine running through it. So it's interesting. It's the eventual reinvention of a different kind of airport type. It was a few years ago that I was approached by somebody who's an African expert, and he said something along the lines, "You've done the biggest airports in the world. How would you feel about doing the smallest in the world?" And that is a drone port. And the idea for rural Africa is that it would be self-construct. It would be using the local earth with an additive. It would be creating building products, and then those would be assembled over a lightweight formwork by local communities. And the drone port would have a social dimension. It could be the marketplace, as well as catering for the storage, the recharging of the drones. And interestingly, that has been here. We created as a foundation project, working with 3 universities as a pavilion, an entrance pavilion, which was in use for about 5 or 6 years for the Venice Biennale. And so this was a working demonstration. And the fact that the students could create this also was proof of concept that a local community could do likewise. And that was the inspiration for a company called Zipline that, that delivers urgent medical supplies, principally in Rwanda, but it has expanded outside of Africa and is now delivering to rural communities in Europe. And if I move from a continent where this enables the new technology of drones to be able to leapfrog the absence of established infrastructure back into Europe, then this project is about the connections in infrastructure terms between cities, in this case between Barcelona and Paris. So the community is a rural community which has suffered because of the valley, has suffered a break in the continuity of the prime artery, the A6 through France, where it comes to the Massif Central, relatively, at that time, poor area of France. And that led to the Millau Viaduct. And here we can see the comparison with the Eiffel Tower in terms of the scale. And the important thing here was, how do you relate to this landscape? How do you try to insert this massive element of infrastructure in such a way that it respects nature, that it touches the ground lightly? And as opposed to the still images, perhaps this little film gives a feel for the scale of that, and a conscious design which seeks to create this 4-kilometer link between the two plateaus. High degree of transparency. It's on a 20-kilometer arc so that you can feel and can see the structure. It's sometimes literally above the clouds. It is the tallest structure in France, some 17 meters taller than the Eiffel Tower. Now, how do you quantify some of the environmental benefits of eliminating, before this viaduct came into, completed the A6, there were 5-hour traffic buildups through the town of Millau, through the local villages. It's very difficult to quantify the carbon savings, but you can get just one glimpse of the environmental benefits from the trucks. The trucks, and you can see the occasional truck, the trucks are monitored by their black boxes. So we do know, we can calculate just on those trucks the tonnage of carbon dioxide saved, which is something like 40,000 tons, which is the equivalent of planting a forest of 40,000 trees. Now, that in a way is a conventional suspension bridge. So it's spanning the maximum distance with the minimum structure, with the minimum intervention in the landscape. We entered a competition for a bridge across the Thames. It would be the first pedestrian bridge in a century. And it would align, it had the potential to align with St. Paul's Cathedral at one end and the Tate Modern at the other. And essentially, it was working with the engineers, reinventing the suspension bridge. In other words, a suspension bridge normally has a lot above the deck. How do you do a suspension bridge which will give you this maximum span, but with the minimum visual interference? And here you can see, alongside the walkway, very, very uninterrupted, the vista across to St. Paul's. It's interesting to compare some of the predictions for this bridge. It was estimated that 4 million people would cross it in a year. The reality is that twice as many people crossed it. Also, it was estimated it would generate 1,500 jobs. It generated 3,000 jobs. There were no hotels in that area. There are now 60 hotels. And of course, the property values reflect that. It's the same mini story as Mio. Mio has become this move from being, in relative terms, poor. It's now a tourist venue. So it's getting the right kind of visitors who actually come to experience the viaduct. So the ripple effect socially from these infrastructure interventions is quite significant. Also in London, if we look now down on Trafalgar Square, which is the symbolic heart of the nation, in the sense that all the distances to remote towns or cities are measured from this central point in London. And it's the setting for many of the most important historic buildings, the National Gallery, the National Portrait Gallery, but it wasn't always like that. If I go back 20 years, this is a fairly typical image of the priorities. In other words, the cars had the priority. The poor pedestrians literally locked up behind iron railings. So if we go back 20 years, then the road in front of the National Gallery with Trafalgar Square to the right was like this. This is how it is now. Just to close one road to pedestrianize, it was, of course, far more complex than that. If I looked at the view from the opposite end, looking back to the point of the previous photograph, then again, and in the heart of the space, here you can see the barrier, you can see the red buses in the background, and of course that connection is established. It's now become the kind of London living room for symphony concerts, circuses, performance, protests, of course. It again is the power of how you continually balance the city, whether it's a capital city like London or whether it's a smaller scale intervention. And what lessons from this might one apply to a community, a smaller town, where that approach of changing the priority in terms of the way a building that is used, the way it relates to a highway. And of course, not too far from here is the Norton Museum, which I'll come to in a moment. But before I do, I just go quickly through some of the tangible benefits that we can measure around Trafalgar Square. So with the intervention, the pedestrian movement was multiplied by a factor of some 13. Not surprisingly, because you can walk diagonally across that space. You can use space. Instead of it going around like a roundabout, the walking time is halved. The congestion in the center was reduced by 30%. CO2 you can measure. And because it also coincided with a congestion charge, then that congestion charge generates something around 120 million contribution to improving the quality of public transport. If I now just talk ever so briefly about perhaps the lessons of priority on the project in the Norton Museum. So this is how we found the Norton Museum and its relationship to the Dixie Highway, which fronts it. Now, you can see very clearly there's a front door there. If you go to that front door, it says, oops, this is not an entrance. And it says, please follow the sidewalk to the south-facing facade or entrance. So, assuming that you've got your compass and you can find out where south is, then you're in good stead. We brought back the axial plan of this. We recycled the main building top right there, and we embraced the 200-year-old banyan tree with a canopy, and we brought back the entrance to the front, celebrated with a Cy Twombly, Klaus Oldenburg, excuse me, a typewriter eraser in a reflecting pool. And interestingly, before this initiative, perhaps not surprisingly, the whole circulation, this is where you would be led to the car park. So reversing those priorities also liberated the opportunity to change that car park, which you can see there, which was before our intervention was this, and that car park is now the sculpture garden and is a celebration of the flora and fauna of the extraordinary part of Florida. And that's bringing back the original historic master plan, where the entrance was at the top relating to the view of the water. And it's interesting, the power of culture, the regenerative, I mean, just very, very difficult to translate the warmth, the welcome, the embrace of this building and its facilities by that local community. If I come to a very different kind of museum, a museum which is created from scratch. It doesn't have any antecedents. Perhaps the inspiration here, this is a museum in Abu Dhabi, and it is to commemorate the memory of Sheikh Zayed, who was the founder of the Emirates. And so how ecologically do you try to learn from history in terms of reducing the energy demands and creating the identity very much of the Sheikh Zayed, which was also somebody who encouraged falconry and was fascinated by birds. Well, in my previous life, I was and am passionate about flight, and this was a sailplane that I flew for many years, Caliph Caproni, and as these sketches would show, top left, you stay aloft in a sailplane without a motor by rising currents of air called thermals. And those diagram on the top right, that principle kept residences cool in the desert because they would use a wind tower and capture the air movements aloft and pull air from below. And of course, below the desert floor, it's really quite cold. So if you use that principle, if you create feather-like elements in the sky that will heat up, they will create the air movement, the vertical thermals, and pull the air deep down below the desert floor where it's cool. So you're dramatically reducing the energy load of the building. You're also getting cool, fresh air. So if we look at a kind of cross-section through that building, you can see these bowl-like galleries which are suspended in between these stainless steel feathers. And The museum itself is mound-like, so it's very protective, and it's pulling that cold air from below, and is related to a green oasis, literally, in the desert. And that is under construction. This is a recent shot of those feather-like elements. This is the glimpse, flavor of the internal spaces with the natural top light, and that is the team in Abu Dhabi. So that was a few months ago. And if I now move to the workplace and a project that was mentioned earlier into the context of California, and how do you take a site of 24 buildings, 50% of it, not surprisingly, covered in tarmac, on-site parking, very, very little landscape, some 20%. How do you transform that into the conversations with Steve Jobs, how you create the Californian fruit basket of his youth? How do you bring that California landscape back? And here we're talking about nearly 1,000 trees. We're talking about 3 times the number of people, but essentially creating a landscape. And that circular building looks very much like a kind of instant concept of the circle in the landscape. This just gives a flavor of, again, why for something that looks so simple, it took 9 months of intensive work trying to reconcile the realities of the site with the internal planning. And the circle came at a 9-month into that process. And here you can see that from above. What it doesn't tell you is the scale of the internal space, which when you are in that space and you look for the building, you can see that it is really hugging the skyline. It's almost the skyline itself. And if you're outside of that circle, it's very much an element in the landscape. And that facade is working holistically. It's very much about working with nature, using the ambient air temperature, which you can do even in New York for something like 70% of the time, and in a California landscape even further. And the top of the external glazing, those eyebrows, are reducing the glare, also reflecting the view inside. But the top of those eyebrows is the element with the filters that is enabling fresh air. So you're increasing the volume, the building is healthier, it's also reducing the energy demand. If you're on that external corridor, again, it's very much about the landscape, and those eyebrows are reflecting the landscape and the greenery deep into the building. So this aspect of nature, whether that's in the workplace or whether it's in a city, and interestingly, very, very similar brief, similar number of people around, 4,000. So how do we apply those principles in a dense historic quarter of London, the financial district? And if I put a red line around the building, then the idea of the arcade that would divide that building is a response to an old Roman road called Watling Street. And you can see there that again is leading to the axis of St. Paul's. And that arcade is a very traditional device historically in London. And we retranslated that into an arcade with restaurants, with bars. And this was very much a part of a social policy by Bloomberg that certain facilities would be provided within the building, but there would be a conscious encouragement for local traders. This is very, very different from, say, an operation like Google that will go into a city, they will provide everything. And then, not surprisingly, the context of that setting, that neighborhood, then has economic problems because the local traders are no longer necessary, whether that's dry cleaning, whether it's a gym, whether it's a restaurant or a bar. So again, this is part of the architecture, but it's also part of a wider strategy. And I showed you how the air moved in the Apple building. Here, the air is coming through the elements on the facade, those grill-like elements. And again, the social movement within the building, everybody goes to what is called the pantry on the 7th floor. That's where the social action is. And you saw the pedestrian spiral in the heart of the building. Well, you can see it right there in the background. And everything for this building was designed in terms of sustainability. So, for example, the ceiling is a hot or a cold radiator, as well as being the acoustic fabric that enables the hardwood floor to work acoustically. And it's also, of course, the lighting. There's something like 500,000 very, very small LEDs. And I haven't talked about the process of design, but I'll just give a little glimpse. To achieve this, we built a fully working prototype with all, here you see the same ceiling and the mechanical equipment. The individual numbers are occupants who are being monitored. And all this equipment can simulate in this space the exact weather conditions that you would experience, together with the pollution in the street. So we're able to test those fins with filters. So this is just a glimpse of the design process behind some of these buildings. And again, the contact with nature, very important. And if you move behind the landscaping, then you'll see here the work by an artist and the integration of art in these projects is not something that I've talked about, but I'll give a glimpse of it finally in the last project. This is a sculpture using water by Christine Iglesias, the Spanish artist. In a very subtle way, this is the security of the project. Because in many buildings, like the Houses of Parliament, you will see the most horrible, ugly, protective lumps of concrete. These people sitting here, this is the security for the building, which is answering the code requirements in a very unexpected way. The role of nature, whether it's in the workplace or whether it's in the process of healing, deliberately here, that building in the background, very, very small building compared with some of the projects that I've been showing you, but arguably far more important in terms of that community. This is a charity, it's a Maggie's Center. It's for those who, when they're diagnosed with cancer, can find support, can find information. And it is the most deliberately domestic building in this group of buildings, to the extent that it has the front porch. When you're going through that porch, you would find a kitchen, you would find a dining room. If you moved along further, you would come to the greenhouse, which grows the flowers, which decorate the place, which again is all part of that therapeutic process. So the garden, whether that is in a health building or the connection with landscaping in terms of arguably the healing power of a small chapel. This is a small chapel in a garden in Venice. It's certainly the smallest project. And as somebody, we had an exhibition recently in the Pompidou Gallery in Paris, and somebody remarked that the largest model was of the smallest building. And the model was almost as big as the building itself. It really is quite small, but very much a kind of harmony with nature. And that link to nature, we're doing a lot of work on hospitals, medical facilities. Here in America, we're privileged to be doing the master plan for the Mayo Clinic. We recently completed a building in Philadelphia. And this is a glimpse a hospital, a 500-bedroom hospital. This is a glimpse of its setting. And that is the building. It is the scale of a hospital. It deliberately picks up the coloration of the historic core buildings in the heart of Philadelphia. And the contact with nature. An operating theater, not surprisingly, is windowless, it's hermetically sealed. But all the surgeons in that floor where all the operating theaters are located, their circulation route is on the edge of the building. So they have that relief of the view of the city, that contact with the outside world as they move from one theater to another and the research which we started with those responsible for the commissioning of the project started with how are you received ideally in a hotel. So it started with the customer, the patient, being at the heart of the process. And again, just giving another glimpse into the design process. When we had developed the design to a certain point, we then persuaded the hospital to take the largest open plan warehouse in one of the suburbs of Philadelphia and build a full-size mock-up of the hospital floor. And that then was host to the nurses, to the surgeons, to the doctors, to the maintenance people. And as a result of that full-size mock-up, the design changed. And interestingly, not surprisingly, when that hospital opened, all the individuals, they saw the results of their input into that full-size mock-up. And again, this was the working mock-up of the patient's room. And here is its translation into the final patient's bedroom. Now, a lot of the things that I've described as generators, the contact with nature, the importance of a view, a shaft of sunlight, an awareness of the changing of the seasons. All of those were subjective. They were passionately held opinions when I started in my colleagues. The difference now, all of those have been scientifically proven to be beneficial, to be good for your health. And the final proof is the reality that patients who are recovering from surgery in a room with a view, they leave hospital earlier than those who don't have a view. And the view here is of the city, and that takes me to the final project of the practice, and that is the currently under construction, the headquarters for JP Morgan, a 60-story, 1,400 high skyscraper. And if this is the rendering of the way in which it touches the ground with its vast cantilevers, then you can see how it looks at the moment as a building site. And that, if you entered through the entrance on Park Avenue, then you would see through to Madison. So it's an entire city block, and it brings together a number of artists. Gerhard Richter, the German artist who's responsible for these two very large murals. And if you move through to Madison, then here we're seeing the facade, which is a work by Maya Lin. And finally, on the skyline, and again, this is the first largest all-electric high-rise building. So it's totally carbon-free energy. It's pulling twice the code amount of air, so it's a healthier building. And I'm often asked by journalists, how can you justify a tall tower in terms of sustainability? And it's quite interesting. If we look at very recent research by two researchers from Berkeley, and they analyzed household carbon footprints. I don't expect you to be able to read that from the distance, but simplistically, all the reds, all the yellows are very, very high carbon footprint. The lowest carbon footprint is the dark green. And that dark green is Manhattan. And that's because New York is a compact, walkable, pedestrian-friendly, neighborhood-oriented city. So the combination of the high-rise, and interestingly, because of those cantilevers, this new building has a population 4 times the building that it replaces. It's twice as high, but it delivers 2.5 times the amount of space in the public domain at the sidewalk, and a large proportion of that as garden. Now, the emphasis so far has been very kind of Western-centric, and very much about the products of a practice which is operating in the real world, answering the responses to those who commission. But there are many needs which are not answered, whether that's in the educational domain or whether it's in projects for informal settlements, those projects which are perhaps not considered architecture. And so just a glimpse to end with of one of 3 Norman Foster foundations. This is the one in Madrid. There's an American Friends of the Foundation. There's a London-based foundation. The one in Madrid is truly global reach. It's headquartered here. It's an existing building which was restored to its original turn of the century splendor, with a new pavilion in the background there. And that was launched in 2017. There's been a very strong educational program of public debates involving the city, workshops that will bring together 10 experts from around the world as mentors with 10 students, a week-long workshop. And that's already, in terms of its alumni, has found its first, if it was about anticipating the future and civic leaders, it's found its first architect turned politician, a 28-year-old who is now a mayor in Chile and has been responsible for bringing a consortium of mayors on issues of conservation. And one of these workshops, glimpse here, was about refugee housing. And we had the state-of-the-art tents, because if you're a refugee, you're given a tent. And the best example of a tent has a 3-year life. But most tents, conventional tents, and we put one together in the courtyard of the foundation, most tents have a 1-year life. And the average stay in a refugee camp is 17 years. So not surprisingly, the students said, this is crazy. Why isn't there something in between? Why can't you build a durable, permanent building quickly? Why can't you industrialize it? And that was put to the test. This was the year before last. The workshop was in June, and we started on a project, proof of concept, to try to demonstrate the feasibility of creating something very, very quickly that would be durable, that would be more than a sheet of cloth against the the elements. And we had set by the sponsor of the workshop the challenge to produce it in time for the Venice Biennale. So we had six months. And this is a diagram of what we did. It's essentially, if you imagine a lightweight formwork, it describes a very economical arch. It's the equivalent of an arch that an artisan would use to define a catenary and then turning it round. Over that very light formwork, removable afterwards, we draped a material which had never been used for buildings before, been used to make rigid landscapes, to stop rocks falling. It was a canvas impregnated with a low carbon cement. And we draped that over and under this building. And you spray that with water, and in a few hours, it's rigid. In 24 hours, it's structurally sound as an arch. And then flat pack the interior. And that produced, in 6 months, this little prototype. And that would take a family of 4. The lower spaces on the edge of the arch are ideal as kind of cubby holes for bunk beds, for bathrooms, for kitchen. If you go inside this, then this is how it's working. So you can see it's a tallish space, top lit. The interesting thing was, when we launched this in Venice as a refugee shelter, which at scale would be material cost something like $20,000. Everybody fell in love with it. They said, I'd love to spend a night in it. I'd love one in my garden, big garden. So it's, and we ran in parallel with it in a palazzo, a short walk away, an exhibition that showed how, with modifications, depending on the degree of insulation or shading, it could respond to the tropics or it could respond to the tundra, extreme cold, extreme heat. And a reminder that some 4 million refugees live in camps around the world in essentially cloth structures. And so we started to explore how, instead of a barrack-like layouts, you could create social spaces, you could create squares. And that has been picked up by one enlightened government and has produced a response to their housing needs, several hundred every year. Now we're now working with that government, and we're working to their cost deadlines. And the UN Habitat has calculated that something like 94,000 housing units are needed to be produced every day to meet the population growth in those Latin American, Asian, African cities. And so this is ultra low cost. So you get, for $16,000 a unit, you got a living room with a kitchen, you get 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a porch. So how some of these wider messages about the importance of sustainability and the city, how do we get those messages out to a wider audience, to those who make policy decisions? Because in this excerpt from the introduction earlier this year, in January, to an institute which we've created, an extension of the foundation, which has now a 1-year master's course for civic leaders of the future. And this is part of my introduction to that course. Right now, there are some 30 plus from 23 countries on 4 continents who are going through that master's course, and at the end of the year, underwritten by the Autonomous University of Madrid, they will receive their master's degree. So this is paraphrasing Winston Churchill. We shape our cities and they shape us. So those decisions in terms of responding to change, whether it's the creation of a new city or it's the remodeling, the balancing of an existing city in terms of its citizens, movement, mobility, will those decisions be based on hard-edged reality, data, facts, or will they be based on fashion, on prejudice? Will that process involve the community? Will the community be involved in a bottom-up, or will it be imposed on a top-down? And you can see there is a thread going through here. Whether one's talking about a city or you're talking about a hospital, it's involving those in the process, those who will be using the building or the city. And do we ever learn the lessons of history, whether that's in politics or architecture or urbanism? So whether I'm talking as an urbanist or an architect. So if it's a new course, what makes it different? Whether I'm talking to young people through our children and hearing how they view the universities that they're studying at, or whether it's me wearing another hat in the practice and seeing graduates coming out of schools, the reality is that we're all very grateful to universities. They generate a wealth of talent, but there is a disconnect between the real world outside and academia inside. So this course integrates academia with hands-on experience. So we have 3 pilot cities. They're European at the moment. Next year they'll be African. The year after they'll be North American. We'll cycle it because the approach is applicable to all kinds of cities. It's not specific to one city because it is about data. It is about how you use the digital tools to create a digital twin of a city so that you can use that technology to explore the implications of change before you make the change. We have a debt, in this case, if I'm the one of 2 directors, then my fellow director is from MIT, from the City Lab there, Kent Larson, and we learn greatly from their work ongoing on cities where you can model digitally. We also, because I have a third role, and that is with the United Nations, where I'm the elected advocate for cities, for the Forum of Mayors. So I convene and encourage the pooling of experience between mayors from Europe, North America, and Asia. So not surprisingly, the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN would be incorporated into the course. And on that note, I was invited to address the General Assembly in New York of the United Nations on the importance of master planning. And I finished my talk with an extract from Daniel Burnham and his presentation to the city of Chicago, 1909. And it's applicable beyond a city. It could be about a course, it could be about a work of architecture, it could be about any venture. And he says, make no little plans, make big plans, because a noble, logical diagram will never die. Let your watchword be order and your beacon be beauty. Thank you.